The voice on the intercom didn't congratulate us. It cataloged us. I didn't smash the camera, and I didn't scream into the microphone. If Vanguard's board of directors wanted to see what a traumatic pair bond looked like, I was going to show them exactly how violent it could get. In the pristine, sterile light of the overseer hub, the absolute silence felt heavier than the freezing dark of the cell blocks. The revelation on the screen should have broken us apart. It should have made us question every glance, every touch, every desperate decision we had made over the last 48 hours. It didn't. Stella didn't pull her hand out of my grip. Instead, she stepped closer, completely eliminating the remaining inches between us. Her hip pressed flush against mine, the heat of her body radiating through my damp clothes. She looked up from the glowing terminal, her dark eyes locking onto mine. I thought the hardest truth to swallow was that our company had crashed our plane. I was wrong. The hardest truth was that Vanguard knew me better than I knew myself. True psychological manipulation doesn't create a dynamic out of nothing. It simply builds a crucible to accelerate what is already there. They didn't invent this, Stella whispered, her voice a low, raspy purr meant only for me. Her free hand slid up to my chest, her fingers curling possessively into the fabric of my shirt over my heart. The lingering effect of the inhibitor serum kept her heart rate slow, but the raw, unadulterated territoriality in her touch was electric. They just forced the timeline. You're mine, Nolan. Not theirs. I know, I breathed, my thumb stroking the back of her hand. The dark romantic tension between us had completely mutated. It was no longer a byproduct of survival. It was the weapon we were going to use to burn this facility to the ground. Behind us, a sharp, ragged gasp shattered the intimacy of the moment. Victoria was standing on the other side of the central console, her face completely drained of blood. The Vanguard CEO was staring at the lower half of the behavioral trial #404 manifest. I watched the exact moment her entire worldview collapsed. For 2 days, Victoria had desperately clung to the delusion that she was the most important person on the island. She believed her title was a shield. But Vanguard didn't care about her title. To the board, she was just another piece of lab equipment. Expendable, Victoria choked out, her voice cracking as she read the glowing text aloud. Secondary assets. Designation. Expendable control group baseline paranoia catalyst. Projected mortality rate during phase 1, 80%. She looked up, her perfectly manicured hands trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the steel console to stay upright. The wound on her forehead had stopped bleeding, but her eyes were completely fractured. They didn't even want me, she whispered, the sheer, crushing humiliation breaking her faster than the biological asset ever could. I built this company's quarterly growth for 5 years and they brought me here to be bait for an HR experiment. Welcome to the bottom of the spreadsheet, Victoria, Harper muttered bitterly from the swivel chair. The engineer wasn't crying anymore. The shock of the overseer hub had burned out her panic, leaving only a hollow, exhausted cynicism. I turned my back on the camera mounted above the console. Let Vanguard watch. Let them record the biometric data. Iris, I commanded, my voice flat and authoritative. Can they vent the air in this room? Can they deploy chemical countermeasures through the HVAC? The corporate spy was already typing furiously on a secondary terminal. No. The hub operates on a closed-loop, analog life support system to protect the overseers during a Level 4 containment breach. We have 48 hours of recycled oxygen and localized battery power. But they just locked us out of the external communications array. We can't broadcast an SOS. I don't want an SOS, I said, leaning over her shoulder to look at the diagnostic screen. I want an inventory. Find the armory on this level. Find the manual override for the blast doors. If Phase 1 was surviving the crash and the perimeter breach, we need to know what Phase 2 is. I'm trying, Nolan, but the encryption on the primary directories is military grade, Iris replied, her fingers flying across the keys. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple. It was the first time I had seen her genuinely struggle. Every time I try to access the cleaner's patrol routes, the system physically reroutes the command prompt. Stella stepped away from me, moving to the other side of Iris. She didn't look like a terrified survivor, she looked like the ruthless corporate strategist who used to dismantle my budgets. Don't attack the firewall directly, Iris. "Attack the accounting," Stella ordered, her voice cold and sharp. "It's a Vanguard facility. Every bullet, every MRE, every dose of inhibitor serum has to be cataloged for the quarterly black budget audit. Pull the logistics ledger. Follow the inventory burn rate. It will show you exactly where the armory is, because that's where the most resources are being allocated." Iris blinked, a flicker of genuine respect crossing her face. She immediately shifted her keystrokes, bypassing the security architecture entirely and diving into the facility's localized financial intranet. Within 10 seconds, a wireframe map of Level 4 bloomed across the massive monitor. A cluster of rooms at the far north end of the sector glowed bright blue. "Got it," Iris breathed. "Sector 4 North. Tactical staging area. It's fully stocked, but it's on the other side of the clinical trial block. To get there, we have to walk right past the asset's feeding ground." "Then we walk quiet," I said, checking the magazine of the Glock. I had 11 rounds left. Not enough to fight a squad of cleaners, and entirely useless against the mutated monstrosity roaming the halls outside. Suddenly, the screen blinked. The wireframe map vanished, replaced by a massive, stark red countdown timer taking up the entire monitor. 9:59, 9:58, 9:57. "Iris, what did you do?" Harper yelled, jumping out of her chair. "Nothing." Iris shot back, her hands hovering above the keyboard as the terminal completely locked her out. "It's an automated sequence. Overridden from the surface command center." The red numbers ticked down relentlessly. "Phase 2, Stella whispered, stepping backward until her shoulder hit my chest. Deep inside the thick concrete walls of the overseer hub, a heavy, mechanical grinding sound echoed. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the massive, industrial ventilation shafts above us. With a sickening, metallic clunk, the heavy steel louvers of the air vent snapped wide open. And from the pitch-black shafts, the unmistakable, sickly sweet smell of rotting fruit and bleach began to pour directly into the sealed control room. The smell hit the back of my throat like battery acid. It wasn't just a foul odor, it was a heavy, chemical aerosol that instantly burned the mucous membranes in my nose and made my eyes water. Within 5 seconds, Victoria collapsed to her knees, violently dry-heaving onto the pristine carpet of the overseer hub. Harper stumbled backward, clutching her throat, her chest heaving as she desperately tried to draw in clean air that no longer existed. "Cover your mouths," I barked, pulling the collar of my jacket up over my nose. I stared at the heavy steel louvers of the industrial ventilation shaft above the server racks. The dark, rectangular opening was barely 2 feet wide. The biological asset on level 4 was 8 feet tall with a shoulder span wider than a doorframe. It couldn't fit through the ductwork. I thought Vanguard was opening the vents to let the monster in. I was wrong. They were pumping the monster's environment directly into our lungs. "It's a neurostimulant," Iris choked out, pressing her sleeve against her face. Her eyes were watering, but her mind was still calculating at lightning speed. "It's an aerosolized variant of the asset's pheromone marker. It's designed to trigger the amygdala, hyperparanoia, aggression. They don't want the asset to kill us right now. They want to see if the control group will tear each other apart in a sealed room. Then we seal the room back up," I said, my voice completely muffled by my jacket, but vibrating with a cold, absolute focus. I didn't wait for Iris to hack the system. I turned to the massive, 8-foot-tall data server rack bolted to the floor directly beneath the open vent. "Stella of the knife," I yelled, reaching down to my tactical belt. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask what my plan was. The psychological synthesis Vanguard had engineered was performing flawlessly under pressure. She stepped into my space, her hand brushing intimately against my hip as she drew the heavy combat knife from my rig. She slapped the handle directly into my palm, her dark eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, unwavering trust. "Don't fall," she ordered, a dark, possessive command masked as a warning. I jumped onto the lower edge of the server rack, using the heavy steel handles of the hard drives as footholds, and began to climb. The metal groaned under my weight, the cooling fans whining in protest as my boots crushed the delicate wiring. The air near the ceiling was significantly worse. The yellow, caustic mist was pouring steadily from the vent, burning my skin on contact. My lungs screamed for oxygen, but the inhibitor serum I had injected into Stella wasn't in my veins. My adrenaline was spiking dangerously high, turning my vision into a hyper-focused tunnel. I reached the top of the rack, balancing precariously on the narrow steel edge directly in front of the open vent. The heavy steel louvers were controlled by a localized, motorized actuator bolted to the side of the duct. If I tried to pry them shut by hand, the motor would just force them back open. I needed to kill the motor. "Harper," I shouted down, coughing violently as the gas filled my mouth. "I need to short the actuator." "Which wire kills the failsafe?" I looked down. Harper wasn't looking at me. She was curled into a ball near the console, her hands pulling frantically at her own hair. The neurostimulant was already stripping away her rational mind, flooding her system with raw, unadulterated panic. "Harper, look at me." I roared, but my voice couldn't cut through the chemical terror. Suddenly Stella moved. She didn't try to comfort the engineer. She didn't offer a gentle, reassuring word. Stella dropped to her knees beside Harper, grabbed the collar of the woman's vest with both hands, and slammed her roughly against the side of the steel console. "Stop it," Stella hissed, her voice a deadly, razor-sharp whisper that sliced effortlessly through the panic. She leaned in until she was inches from Harper's face. The lack of adrenaline in Stella's system made her posture incredibly still, terrifyingly calm. "You are an engineer, Harper. Vanguard brought you here because you fix things. If you don't tell him how to fix that vent right now, I will personally throw you out of that blast door and let the thing in the dark have you. Do you understand me?" It was a brilliant, ruthlessly calculated psychological shock. By presenting herself as a more immediate, terrifying threat than the invisible gas, Stella forced Harper's brain to reboot. Harper gasped, her eyes snapping into focus, locking onto Stella's cold, unblinking stare. "The red conduit," Harper stammered, pointing a shaking finger up at the vent. "There's a red conduit bridging the motor. If he severs it and grounds it to the steel frame, it will blow the localized fuse. The louvers will automatically snap shut on a dead circuit." "Good girl," Stella murmured, releasing her grip and standing back up, her eyes immediately finding me in the haze. "Red conduit, Nolan. Ground it." I jammed my hand into the dark, filthy ductwork. My fingers brushed against the greasy, motorized actuator. I felt a thick bundle of wires and isolated the thickest one. The red conduit. I wedged the serrated edge of the combat knife behind the wire and violently jerked it toward me. The heavy copper shielding snapped. Sparks instantly exploded in the cramped space, showering my face and arms in blinding blue light. I didn't let go. I twisted the exposed copper wire and jammed it directly into the unpainted steel edge of the louver frame. A loud, sharp pop echoed through the ceiling, followed by the smell of ozone and burning plastic. The motorized actuator died instantly. With a heavy, metallic clang, the heavy steel louvers violently snapped shut, sealing off the airflow completely. I dropped from the server rack, hitting the carpeted floor hard, my injured knee buckling under the impact. Stella was there before I could even push myself up. She dropped beside me, her hands instantly framing my face, her thumbs wiping the stinging chemical residue from my cheeks. Her touch was possessive, desperate, and entirely indifferent to the fact that Iris and Victoria were watching. "Breathe," she commanded softly, her forehead pressing against mine. Slowly. "It's closed." I closed my eyes, letting the physical reality of her anchor me as my lungs desperately tried to filter the remaining toxic air in the room. The dark, codependent gravity between us was an addiction, and Vanguard had just given us an overdose. "The vent is sealed," Iris said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence of the hub. The corporate spy was back at the main terminal, wiping tears from her chemically burned eyes as she stared at the massive monitor. The red countdown timer was still ticking. 4:22, 4:21, 4:20. Why is the timer still running? I rasped, pushing myself up to a sitting position, my arm instinctively wrapping around Stella's waist, keeping her close. "Because the timer wasn't for the gas," Iris whispered, her voice dropping to a hollow, terrified register. She pointed to a small line of text blinking in the bottom right corner of the screen. "Phase 2, hub battery depletion and containment release. The overseer hub runs on a localized battery when the primary grid goes down," Iris explained, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. "Vanguard didn't just lock us out of the comms. They initiated a total battery purge. When that timer hits 0, this room loses power. And the blast door? Victoria asked, her voice a fragile, broken shell of its former self. The blast door is held shut by an electromagnetic seal, Iris answered, turning to look at us, the sheer, inescapable reality of our situation settling over the room like a shroud. When the power dies, the seal breaks. The door opens automatically to prevent the overseers from suffocating. I looked at the timer. 4 minutes. In 4 minutes, the heavy steel door separating us from the pitch-black, freezing corridor of the testing sector was going to slide open. And whatever was out there in the dark, hunting the bleeding cleaners would be waiting for us. 4 minutes isn't enough time to build a fortress, but it's just enough time to build a kill box. I stared at the stark red numbers ticking down on the main monitor. 3:59. My brain instantly compartmentalized the fear, locking it away in a dark corner of my psyche, leaving only a cold, mechanical arithmetic. I had 11 rounds of 9mm ammunition, a combat knife, and a stun baton. Against a hyperdense, mutated biological asset that could shred reinforced steel, my weapons were essentially violently loud paperweights. I couldn't shoot it to death. I had to change the math. Iris, I snapped, pivoting away from the monitor and looking at the massive, humming server racks lining the walls. If this room is running on a localized battery backup, where is the main capacitor? Where is the heaviest draw of raw voltage? Iris didn't hesitate. She was already wiping the stinging tears from her eyes, her mind locking onto the logistics. She pointed to a heavy, industrial gray panel bolted to the floor near the blast door. The primary uninterrupted power supply. It regulates the current for the mainframe. It's pushing at least 200 amps to keep these servers alive. Open it, I commanded, pulling the combat knife from my belt. Nolan, you can't, Harper gasped, struggling to push herself up from the carpet. Her face was pale, her voice raw from the chemical gas. If you crack the UPS shielding while it's hot, the arc flash will vaporize your hands. I'm not cracking the shielding, I said, walking briskly toward the door. I'm stripping the feed. I knelt beside the heavy steel threshold of the blast door. The frame was solid, unpainted titanium, a perfect, continuous conductive loop. I jammed the serrated edge of the combat knife into the thick, black rubber casing of the primary power cable running from the UPS box to the servers. I saw a blur of movement in my peripheral vision. Stella dropped to her knees right beside me. She didn't ask what the plan was. She reached out, her hands perfectly steady, and gripped the thick cable, pulling it taut so I could carve through the heavy insulation without slicing the copper core. The physical proximity was intoxicating. Even sweating and breathing toxic air, her presence was the only thing anchoring me to reality. Our shoulders brushed with every brutal saw of the knife, a silent, rhythmic synchronization. When the door opens, the acid is going to charge the highest concentration of pheromones, I muttered, my voice low, meant only for her. We're going to give it a red carpet. An electrified threshold, Stella murmured, immediately grasping the lethal physics of the trap. A dark, dangerous smile ghosted across her lips. It was a terrifyingly beautiful expression. You're going to ground 200 amps directly into its nervous system. Only if we can close the circuit, I said, finally peeling back a 2-foot section of the thick black rubber, exposing the gleaming, braided copper wire beneath. 2:14. Victoria. Stella suddenly barked, her voice cracking like a whip across the room. The Vanguard CEO was still slumped against the far wall, staring blankly at the floor, completely paralyzed by the revelation that her company considered her expendable bait. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Stella stood up, her ruined silk blouse clinging to her skin, and crossed the room in 3 rapid, predatory strides. She grabbed Victoria by the lapels of her expensive, dirt-stained blazer and hauled her violently to her feet. Look at me, Stella hissed, slamming Victoria back against the server rack. The sound of bone hitting metal echoed sharply. Victoria gasped, her eyes wide, tears spilling over her cheeks. Stella, they don't care about us. We're already dead. I am not dead, Stella replied, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register that sent a shiver down my spine. And I refused to die in a basement just because a boardroom of cowards decided I was a statistic. You are going to pick up Maya. You are going to drag her behind the main console. And if you make a single sound when that door opens, I will break your jaw myself. Do you understand? It was brutal. It was entirely stripped of empathy. And it worked flawlessly. Victoria stared into Stella's dark, unyielding eyes, and the sheer, dominant force of Stella's will crushed the last remnants of Victoria's panic. The CEO gave a jerky, terrified nod. Move, Stella commanded, releasing her. I watched Stella walk back to me, the adrenaline masking the pain in her dislocated shoulder. Vanguard wanted to see a traumatic pair bond. They wanted to see if extreme stress would break us. Instead, they had forged a weapon. I wasn't just surviving this island anymore. I was going to conquer it with her. 105 Iris, the baton, I said, holding my hand out. The spy tossed me the heavy, black stun baton. I caught it by the rubberized grip. I didn't turn it on. I placed the exposed copper wire flat across the titanium threshold of the door. We leave a 1-inch gap between the live wire and the steel frame, I explained, looking at Stella and Iris. The circuit is open. The electricity has nowhere to go. When the asset steps on the threshold, its body mass will bridge the gap, but it needs a catalyst to jump the current. I handed the stun baton to Stella. When its foot hits the metal, I said, holding her gaze, entirely trusting her with my life, you jam the baton against the copper wire and pull the trigger. The 1,000,000-volt discharge from the baton will act as a primer, forcing the 200 amps from the server battery to arc directly through the monster's heart. Stella took the baton. Her fingers brushed against mine, a lingering, deliberate caress that spoke volumes. She didn't tremble. She gripped the heavy weapon, her jaw set. I won't miss. 030 everyone behind the console, I ordered, chambering around in the Glock. The metallic clack was deafening in the quiet room. Harper, kill the lights. We don't want to be silhouetted against the monitors. Harper hit the breaker switch on the wall. The pristine white LEDs died instantly. The room plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the faint, eerie red glow of the countdown timer on the main screen. 010. I stood exactly 10 feet back from the blast door, raising the Glock, holding it in a steady, two-handed grip. I aimed dead center at the seam of the heavy steel doors. Stella knelt on the floor to my right, hidden in the dark shadows of the server rack. She held the stun baton inches from the exposed copper wire, her eyes locked on the titanium threshold. 3 I controlled my breathing. In, out, heart rate steady. The inhibitor serum in Stella's veins made her an absolute ghost to the creature, which meant I was the brightest beacon in the room. I wanted it to look at me. I wanted it to charge me. The timer flashed and blinded. Deep inside the walls, the heavy electromagnetic seals lost power with a deep, resonant thunk. A sharp hiss of depressurization cut through the silence. The massive, heavy steel blast doors slowly ground open, retracting into the concrete walls, revealing the pitch-black abyss of the Level 4 testing sector corridor. I held my breath, my finger tight on the trigger. Silence. The corridor outside was completely, horrifyingly quiet. There was no dragging sound. No rapid slapping of bare feet on the tiles. The freezing air rolled into the hub, carrying the stench of blood, but the hallway was empty. Nolan, Harper whimpered from the dark corner behind the console. Quiet, I hissed, my eyes straining against the absolute blackness of the hallway. 10 seconds passed. Nothing moved. I thought the acid had retreated. I thought it was hunting the remaining cleaners on another level. I was wrong. The biological nightmare Vanguard created wasn't just a brute force predator. It was an ambush hunter. It didn't walk through the door. It dropped from the ceiling. A massive, pale gray mass of hyperdense muscle violently detached itself from the concrete ceiling directly outside the door, crashing down onto the tiles with a wet, sickening thud. It was horrifyingly fast. The unhinged jaw clicked wildly, the pale, eyeless face snapping directly toward me. It didn't roar. It simply coiled its elongated limbs and launched itself forward like a biological missile, aiming straight for my chest. Now, I roared. The asset's massive, clawed foot slammed down onto the titanium threshold. In the dark, Stella lunged forward. She jammed the tip of the stun baton directly against the exposed copper wire and pulled the trigger. 1,000,000 volts from a stun baton is just a spark. 200 amps of raw server current is a localized lightning strike. The moment Stella pulled the trigger, the pitch-black threshold of the overseer hub exploded into a blinding, catastrophic flash of blue-white plasma. The sheer concussive force of the electrical arc bridging the gap through the asset's chest knocked the breath completely out of my lungs. The creature didn't roar. Its unhinged jaw snapped wide open, but the electricity violently seized its vocal cords, producing a horrific, high-pitched mechanical hiss that vibrated right through the concrete floor. It thrashed backward, its elongated limbs violently convulsing as the current literally cooked it from the inside out. The air in the corridor instantly filled with the suffocating, nauseating stench of vaporized blood, burnt ozone, and charred meat. And then, the trap backfired. Vanguard's isolated battery grid was designed to run diagnostic computers, not execute biological anomalies. The massive, sustained power draw violently surged back through the stripped cable. Behind me, the massive server racks exploded in a shower of sparks. The heavy industrial capacitors blew out with a series of deafening, shotgun-like pops, plunging the entire overseer hub into absolute, suffocating darkness. The faint hum of the life support system died instantly. The heavy blast door groaned, its retracted gears grinding to a violent halt, permanently jammed wide open to the freezing corridor. I didn't lower the Glock. I kept the barrel trained on the smoking, twitching mass of pale flesh lying just beyond the titanium threshold. "Don't move," I rasped, the smoke burning my throat. The asset's elongated fingers spasmed once, scraping weakly against the slick tiles, and then the massive creature went entirely limp. The localized pheromone hunter was dead. In the dark, a hand grabbed my jacket. Stella pulled me backward, away from the toxic, smoking threshold. She didn't let go once I was out of the immediate hazard zone. She slid her hands up my chest, her fingers curling tightly around the collar of my shirt, pulling me down until my forehead rested heavily against hers. She was breathing fast, her chest heaving against mine, but her hands were perfectly steady. "It's dead," she whispered, her breath hot against my lips. The dark vanilla of her perfume cut through the brutal stench of the corridor. It was a terrifyingly intimate moment, two corporate executives standing over the smoking corpse of a genetically engineered monster, finding absolute comfort in the violence they had just committed together. "You didn't miss," I murmured, my free hand sliding down to grip her waist, anchoring her against me. The possessive instinct inside me was entirely sated by the way she yielded to my touch in the dark. She was the weapon, and I was the trigger. Vanguard wanted a synthesis, and they had created a nightmare. "Nolan," Iris's voice cut through the darkness, trembling slightly. The corporate spy clicked on her tactical flashlight, the pale beam sweeping over the blown-out, smoking servers. "The UPS is completely slagged. The mainframe is dead. The HVAC is dead. We just destroyed the only secure room on level 4. "It wasn't secure anyway," I said, reluctantly breaking the physical contact with Stella, but keeping her firmly behind my shoulder. I turned to look at the destroyed hub. If we had stayed in here, Phase 2 would have suffocated us or let that thing tear us apart. "We have to move." "Move where?" Victoria whimpered. The CEO was trembling violently, her expensive blazer covered in dust and chemical residue. She was staring at the charred, massive corpse of the asset blocking the doorway, her eyes wide with a terror that had completely shattered her mind. "It's out there." "The Dar?" "It's all out there." I didn't have time for her breakdown. I walked over to the threshold, stepping carefully over the exposed, melted copper wire. I looked down at the biological asset. Up close, the horror of what Vanguard had built was undeniable. The pale translucent skin was stretched over hyperdense muscle fibers that looked almost synthetic. The joints were artificially modified, reinforced with metallic subdermal plating. This wasn't a natural mutation. This was a multi-million-dollar military-grade weapon, and Vanguard had thrown it at us just to collect biometric data. "Iris, where is Sector 4 North?" I asked, stepping completely over the corpse and out into the freezing, pitch-black corridor of the testing sector. Iris stepped carefully over the body, her flashlight beam shaking as she tried not to look at the unhinged jaw of the monster. "It's at the extreme north end of this corridor. Straight down. It's past the primary clinical containment block." Harper, Victoria, Stella commanded, her voice slipping effortlessly into the cold, ruthless cadence of a Vanguard executive. Pick up Maya. You carry her between you. If you drop her, if you make a sound, I will leave you in the dark. Move. They didn't argue. Victoria and Harper practically scrambled over the dead asset, hauling the unconscious intern up between them. Fear of the dark was paralyzing, but fear of Stella's absolute lack of empathy was a far more effective motivator. We formed a tight column. I took the lead, the Glock raised, the heavy tactical flashlight in my left hand illuminating the slick, frost-covered tiles. Stella stayed at my right shoulder, matching my pace perfectly. Iris covered our rear. We moved deeper into the testing sector. The destruction down here was catastrophic. The asset hadn't just hunted, it had raged. Thick, steel medical doors were torn completely off their hinges. Heavy, reinforced gurneys were crushed like aluminum cans. The walls were smeared with massive, dark streaks of blood from the cleaners who had tried to secure the floor. I thought the silence meant the corridor was empty. I was wrong. The silence meant the apex predators were already waiting. We were 50 yards away from the heavy steel doors of Sector 4 North. Suddenly, my flashlight beam caught something highly reflective in the dark. I instantly clicked the light off. Down. I hissed, shoving Stella against the concrete wall and dropping to a crouch. At the far end of the corridor, blocking the entrance to the armory, were 3 distinct, piercing green laser beams cutting through the freezing mist. They weren't sweeping randomly. They were locked in a perfectly spaced, tactical triangular formation, aimed directly down the hallway toward us. And then, the mechanical, heavy sound of pressurized gas masks echoed through the dead air. Target group identified. A synthesized, modulated voice barked over a localized comms unit. Primary asset is compromised. Switch to Phase 2 containment. Lethal force authorized for all expendable designations. Secure the primary subjects. They didn't want Victoria. They didn't want Harper or Maya. They wanted me and Stella. And they were going to execute everyone else in the hallway to get us. The green lasers didn't waver, painting the freezing mist of the corridor like a predator's targeting array. I didn't wait for the synthesized voice to finish the execution order. I grabbed Stella's shoulder and violently dragged her down behind the massive, charred corpse of the biological asset just as the hallway erupted. The suppressed whip of automatic fire was deafening in the enclosed space. High-velocity rounds slammed into the concrete walls, shattering the remaining frosted glass of the nearby cells. Several rounds thudded sickeningly into the dead monster's dense, mutated flesh, acting as a grotesque, fleshy sandbag between us and the cleaners. Victoria screamed, dropping to the floor and pulling Mia down with her. Harper curled into a fetal position against the wall, her hands clamped over her ears. Iris! Lights out! I roared over the gunfire. Iris instantly killed her tactical flashlight, plunging the corridor back into absolute, suffocating darkness. The gunfire paused. The cleaners were disciplined. They weren't going to waste ammunition spraying blindly when they had the technological advantage. They have NVGs, Stella whispered, her face inches from mine in the dark. Her breathing was fast, but her voice was terrifyingly steady. She was pressed completely against my side, her hand gripping my thigh to anchor herself. Night vision optics. The dark doesn't hide us, Nolan. It only hides them. I checked the Glock by touch. 11 rounds. 3 heavily armored targets with automatic weapons. If they are running standard issue Vanguard panoramic night vision, they are relying on ambient light amplification, I muttered, my mind working frantically. The cold, mechanical auditor was back, calculating angles, distances, and vulnerabilities in a fraction of a second. A sudden, massive spike of lumens will overload the phosphor tubes. It'll temporarily blind them. I have the strobe function on the flashlight, Iris said, crawling on her stomach over the slick tiles until she was pressed against my other side. The corporate spy was trembling, but her tactical conditioning was holding. They're advancing, Stella warned. She was right. Over the ringing in my ears, I could hear the heavy, synchronized crunch of tactical boots stepping over the broken glass, moving methodically down the hall. They were closing the distance, effectively boxing us in against the destroyed Overseer hub. Iris, on my mark, you throw the flashlight as hard as you can straight down the center of the corridor, I ordered. shifting my weight, bringing the Glock up over the charred shoe. Elder of the dead asset. Make sure the strobe is on. Stella, keep your head down. Don't miss. Stella breathed, her fingers digging fiercely into my leg before she ducked lower, pressing her face against my ribs. Mark. Iris hit the heavy rubberized button on the tail cap and hurled the aluminum cylinder down the hallway. The flashlight hit the tiles 30 feet away, spinning wildly, unleashing a blinding, high-frequency, thigh-lumen strobe light. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. In the pitch-black corridor, the aggressive, flashing white light reflected off the frost-covered walls, turning the hallway into a chaotic discotheque of blinding, jagged flashes. Optics blown. Switch to thermal. One of the cleaners shouted, the synthesized voice cracking in sudden, genuine pain as the intensified light burned his retinas through the goggles. I didn't give them time to switch. I rose up from behind the corpse. The strobe light painted the corridor in fragmented frames. I saw 3 matte black figures stumbling, ripping the heavy panoramic goggles off their helmets to clear their vision. I aimed for the closest operator, bypassing the heavy Kevlar plates on his chest and targeting the soft, unarmored gap beneath his ballistic mask. I pulled the trigger 3 times in rapid succession. Crack, crack, crack. The violent recoil snapped through my wrists. In the strobing light, I saw the lead cleaner's head snap violently backward. A spray of dark arterial blood hit the white tiles and his heavy, armored body collapsed backward, his rifle clattering uselessly across the floor. 1 down. 8 rounds left. Before I could transition to the second target, a suppressed burst of return fire shredded the air around my head. A bullet grazed the sleeve of my jacket, burning like a hot iron across my left bicep. I dropped back behind the monster's corpse just as the flashlight shattered into a dozen pieces. One of the surviving cleaners had accurately shot the strobe out. The corridor plunged back into total, unforgiving blackness. I pressed my back against the cold floor, my chest heaving, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding my mouth. My left arm stung fiercely, warm blood soaking through the torn fabric of my jacket. I thought the darkness would level the playing field. I was wrong. It just meant they were pissed off, and I was entirely blind. You're hit, Stella hissed in the dark. I felt her hands immediately moving over my arm, finding the tear in the fabric. Her fingers pressed firmly against the graze to staunch the bleeding. Her touch was frantic, deeply protective, and aggressively intimate in the face of death. Nolan, you're bleeding. It's just a graze, I breathed, keeping my eyes fixed on the impenetrable dark ahead, my right hand keeping the Glock leveled at chest height. Iris, they lost their night vision. Do they have thermal backups? Yes, Iris whispered, her voice tight with rising panic. Vanguard issues dual spectrum optics. They just need 5 seconds to flip the thermal visors down. They'll see our body heat. Then, the synthesized voice of the surviving cleaner echoed down the hall, completely devoid of emotion despite just losing his squad mate. Target zeroed. Thermal lock acquired. Deploying tear gas. Flush them out. A heavy, metallic canister hit the floor 10 feet away, rolling rapidly toward us. A sharp pop echoed in the dark, followed immediately by the violent, high-pressure hiss of expanding chemical gas. The hiss of the CS gas canister was the sound of a ticking clock. Within 3 seconds, the chemical aerosol hit the back of my throat like crushed glass. It wasn't just smoke, it was microscopic shrapnel designed to violently aggressively attack the respiratory system. Beside the charred corpse of the biological asset, Victoria began to retch, a wet, agonizing sound as her lungs desperately tried to reject the toxic air. Harper was thrashing blindly on the tiles, completely consumed by the physiological panic of suffocation. Stella didn't thrash. She didn't scream. She buried her face directly into the curve of my neck, using the thick, blood-stained fabric of my jacket as a makeshift filter. Her fingers dug fiercely into the muscle of my uninjured arm, her body trembling with the effort of taking shallow, controlled breaths. In the absolute dark, her physical trust was absolute. I thought the gas was a death sentence. I was wrong. It was a smokescreen. Nolan, we have to move, Iris choked out, crawling blindly against my leg. The thermals, they're waiting for us to stand up. No, they aren't. I rasped, my brain violently shifting gears, overriding the burning in my eyes with pure, calculating adrenaline. The cleaners rely too much on their tech. CS gas doesn't just spray chemicals. The canister uses a pyrotechnic charge to vaporize the payload. I kept my eyes open, staring into the pitch-black void. I couldn't see the smoke, but I could feel it rolling over us. The expanding cloud is superheated, I whispered, the lethal geometry of the hallway forming in my mind. In a freezing, sub-60-degree corridor, a massive cloud of hot particulate matter creates a thermal bloom. To their dual-spectrum optics, this hallway doesn't look like a clear shooting gallery right now. It looks like a blinding white sun. They can't see our heat signatures through the gas. They're blind? Stella breathed against my jaw, instantly grasping the tactical advantage. For about 30 seconds, until the gas cools and settles, I confirmed, gripping the Glock. I gently but firmly pulled Stella's arms away from my neck. The loss of her body heat was a sharp, physical ache, but I needed to move. Stay behind the monster. Keep the others down. The gas is heavier than air. It's going to settle on the floor. When I move, you pull yourselves up into a crouch. Don't get shot, she commanded. It wasn't a plea, it was a fierce, possessive demand. She reached out in the dark, her hand sliding down my arm to briefly, tightly squeeze my wrist before letting go. I didn't crawl. I stood up directly into the thickest part of the invisible, burning cloud. The pain in my lungs was excruciating, but the inhibitor serum wasn't running through my veins. The raw, violent adrenaline masked the agony. I stepped over the massive arm of the dead asset and moved silently down the center of the corridor. I didn't aim. I listened. 20 feet ahead, through the hissing of the gas. I heard the distinct, frantic clicking of a thermal optic being manually recalibrated. Thermals washed out, a synthesized voice muttered, the heavy modulator struggling to filter the operator's coughing. Switching back to standard NVG. Watch for muzzle flashes. They were standing exactly where I thought they were. I raised the Glock, stepping out of the direct line of the gas canister, and fired twice into the dark. I didn't shoot at the voices. I aimed high, intentionally hitting the heavy steel frame of a shattered medical door to their left. The bullet sparked violently against the metal, creating a brilliant, momentary flash in the pitch black. The cleaners reacted exactly as trained. They pivoted toward the flash, their suppressed rifles spitting a hail of bullets into the empty doorway. They gave away their exact positions. I dropped to a knee, pivoting right, and fired 3 rounds dead center into the muzzle flashes. Crack, crack, crack. A heavy grunt echoed in the dark. The firing on the right stopped instantly as 80 pounds of tactical gear and dead weight hit the frosted tiles. 2 down. 1 left. The surviving cleaner realized the trap a microsecond too late. He swung his rifle back toward the center of the hallway, firing blindly into the gas cloud. A bullet clipped the concrete inches from my ear, showering my face in stone splinters. I didn't return fire. I only had 3 rounds left, and in the dark, a shootout was a coin toss. I dropped the Glock, drew the heavy combat knife from my belt, and lunged forward into the smoke. I hit him at a full sprint. The sheer, physical impact of my body crashing into his tactical vest sent us both flying backward. His rifle clattered away across the floor. We hit the concrete hard, rolling in the freezing, toxic mist. He was a Tier 1 operator, heavily trained in close-quarters combat. But he was fighting a man who had completely surrendered to the darkest, most territorial instincts Vanguard had unlocked. He threw a brutal elbow, catching me in the jaw. My vision swam in a sickening burst of static, but I didn't let go. I grabbed the heavy filter of his gas mask, twisting it violently to the side, exposing the soft, unarmored seam of his neck. I drove the combat knife upward. The struggle ended instantly. The cleaner went rigid, a wet, rattling gasp escaping his ruined throat before he went entirely limp beneath me. I knelt over the body in the pitch black, my chest heaving, my lungs burning, the metallic taste of blood heavy in my mouth. The freezing air of the testing sector was completely silent, save for the faint hiss of the dying gas canister. I had killed 3 highly trained mercenaries in the dark. The cold, analytical auditor was dead. In his place was exactly what Vanguard had engineered. An apex predator, bound by a violent, traumatic synthesis to the woman waiting for me down the hall. Nolan. The voice was soft, cutting through the darkness. I turned. A pale beam of light cut through the dissipating smoke. Iris had scavenged a backup flashlight from the first cleaner I killed. She was leading the group toward me. Stella walked past Iris, completely ignoring the carnage on the floor. She knelt beside me, her hands immediately finding my face, her thumbs tracing the line of my jaw where the cleaner had hit me. Her touch was frantic, searching for fatal wounds, her dark eyes scanning me in the dim light. "I'm fine," I rasped, dropping the bloody knife and letting my forehead rest against hers. "They're dead." "I know," she whispered, her hands sliding down to grip the lapels of my jacket. The possessive relief in her voice was absolute. She didn't care about the bodies. She only cared that I was the one still breathing. "We need their gear," Iris said, stepping around the bodies with clinical detachment. The corporate spy didn't waste time on shock. She knelt beside the man I had just killed and expertly unbuckled his tactical helmet. "Specifically, we need this." She pulled the heavy, dual-spectrum NVG/thermal goggles off the helmet and slipped them over her own head. She adjusted the straps, pulling the visor down over her eyes. "If Vanguard sends another squad, we aren't fighting blind," Iris muttered, her hand reaching up to tap the side of the goggles to activate the thermal imaging. She turned her head, scanning the dark corridor ahead of us. Suddenly, Iris froze. Her breath hitched audibly, her posture going entirely rigid. "Iris?" I asked, pushing myself up to a stand, pulling Stella up with me. "What is it?" "The armory," Iris whispered, her voice trembling, pointing a shaking finger toward the heavy steel doors of Sector 4 North at the end of the hall. "The blast doors to the tactical staging area, they're already open." "Did the cleaners open them?" Harper asked, coughing weakly as she and Victoria dragged Mia forward. "No," Iris said, slowly pushing the goggles up onto her forehead, her eyes wide with a terror that the cleaners hadn't been able to induce. She looked at me, the pale flashlight beam illuminating the absolute dread on her face. "Nolan, there are no weapons in Sector 4 North. The thermal signature inside that room. It's a massive cluster of localized incubators. It's a nursery." I expected racks of suppressed rifles, body armor, and crates of heavy ammunition. Instead, I was staring at a farm. The realization didn't hit me with a sudden spike of fear, it settled into my chest with a cold, absolute disgust that permanently erased whatever was left of the civilized auditor I used to be. Sector 4 North wasn't a tactical staging area. It was an industrial-scale maternity ward. Iris pushed the heavy blast doors completely open. The pristine, sterile white LED lights of the room flickered on automatically, triggered by our movement. The contrast from the pitch-black, smoke-filled corridor was blinding, forcing me to squint as the sheer, horrifying scale of the facility came into view. The room was the size of an airplane hangar. Stretching out in perfect, geometric rows were hundreds of massive, cylindrical glass vats. They weren't glowing with toxic green sci-fi chemicals. They were filled with a warm, amber-colored synthetic amniotic fluid. A low, rhythmic hum vibrated through the floor, the sound of hundreds of automated mechanical lungs pumping oxygen into the tanks. "Oh my God," Harper whispered, collapsing against the doorframe. The engineer slid down the steel wall until she hit the floor, her hands covering her mouth as she stared down the endless aisles of glass. I didn't lower the Glock. I stepped over the threshold, my boots squeaking softly against the immaculate, white antimicrobial flooring. I walked up to the nearest vat. Suspended in the amber fluid was a biological asset in its embryonic stage. It was roughly the size of a 5-year-old child, curled into a tight fetal position. The skin was that same pale, translucent gray, stretched, so tight I could see the hyperdense muscle fibers and the intricate network of dark veins pulsing beneath the surface. The elongated limbs were tucked against its chest, and its jaw, even in this dormant state, was unhinged, revealing rows of tiny, razor-sharp bone ridges. Thick, black umbilical cables were surgically attached to the base of its spine, feeding a steady stream of the yellow inhibitor serum directly into its nervous system to keep it sedated. Vanguard wasn't just capturing these things. Vanguard was manufacturing them. Their clones, Iris breathed, walking up beside me. The corporate spy had pushed her thermal goggles up onto her forehead, her eyes wide as she stared at the digital readout panels bolted to the base of the tank. Genetically engineered bioweapons. This ledger chose an accelerated growth cycle. They incubate them here and then transfer them to the cell blocks for behavioral conditioning. When you discover the true scale of an enemy's operation, panic is a luxury you can no longer afford. You either become completely numb to the horror or it paralyzes you. I chose the former. I felt a sudden, familiar shift in the air to my right. Stella stepped up beside me. She didn't look at the monster floating in the tank. She looked at the reflection of my face in the glass. Her ruined silk blouse was stained with my blood and the ashes of the overseer hub, but her posture was entirely rigid, radiating that terrifying, apex predator calm she had adopted. In the dark. She reached out, her hand sliding down my arm, her fingers curling intimately around my wrist just above the grip of the gun. The physical contact was an anchor, a grounding wire pulling me back from the edge of the abyss. In a room filled with artificially grown nightmares, her touch was the only thing that felt real. They built a factory, Stella murmured, her voice dropping to a low, deadly frequency meant only for me. The board of directors didn't spend billions of dollars to build a factory on a volcanic island just to test a dozen employees. We aren't the primary objective here, Nolan. With a quality control, I replied quietly, turning my hand over just enough to interlock my fingers with hers. The intense, codependent gravity between us pulsed in the quiet hum of the machinery. They bred the weapons. Now they are testing how well the weapons hunt high-level corporate targets under extreme duress. So we break their toys, she whispered, her dark eyes flashing with a ruthless, unapologetic violence that perfectly mirrored my own. Nolan, Victoria whimpered from the doorway. The CEO was still supporting the unconscious Mia, her face completely drained of color as she stared at the endless rows of tanks. There are no guns here. We can't fight our way back up the stairwell. We are trapped in a laboratory with hundreds of them. They're asleep, Victoria, I said, my voice flat, devoid of the empathy she desperately craved. As long as the localized power grid in this room holds, the tanks stay sealed. We just need to find the maintenance exit. Every sector has an exhaust hatch, Iris confirmed, turning away from the tank and pulling her multi-tool from her pocket. If we cross the floor to the back wall, there should be an access point to the primary ventilation shafts. It might lead to the surface or at least back to level 3. Then we walk, I commanded. Stay in the center of the aisle. Do not touch the glass. Do not touch the cables. I kept Stella's hand firmly in mine. We moved forward, navigating the narrow, pristine white aisle between the towering amber vats. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical breathing of the life support systems. The sheer volume of dormant violence surrounding us was suffocating. Every step felt like walking through a minefield. We were halfway across the massive room when the air suddenly grew colder. I stopped. Stella immediately halted beside me, her grip tightening on my hand. What is it? I didn't answer. I raised the Glock, scanning the sterile glare of the overhead LEDs. 50 feet ahead, near the end of the row, the rhythmic hum of the machinery was broken by a sharp, rapid hissing sound. I moved forward cautiously, pulling Stella securely behind my shoulder. As we approached the last row of tanks, the pristine white floor was no longer dry. It was covered in a massive, spreading pool of amber amniotic fluid. I'd aimed the gun at the tank. The heavy, reinforced glass cylinder wasn't glowing. The LED readouts at the base were dead, and the tank was completely empty. The glass hadn't been shattered from the outside by a stray bullet. The thick, 2-inch pane had been violently spider-webbed and punched outward. The thick black umbilical cables were torn, leaking the yellow inhibitor serum onto the floor. I stepped closer, my boots splashing softly in the warm fluid. I crouched down, placing my bare hand hovering an inch over the amber puddle. Nolan? Iris asked, her voice tight as she and the others caught up to us. I stood up, the cold, analytical part of my brain running the terrifying math. The fluid is still warm, I whispered, staring into the dark, shadowed gaps between the massive server racks lining the back wall. It didn't break out during the power outage. It broke out less than 2 minutes ago. We weren't alone in the nursery, and whatever had just hatched was already hunting us.